coming up to our closing keynote of the day, and we're back to Canada again with Mark SANGSTER, VP of eSentire. I've had the opportunity to present with Mark at several conferences in the past, and he always tells a good story. So with that, Mark, over to you. You have the mic and the mouse.
Right. Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for having me today as we talk about finding factors, not fault. And you know, one of the things that we've certainly seen in the last few years with all the types of the significant breaches we've had, in particular with some of the attacks through COVID-19, of course, is that it's really simple to find a single factor, right? Because one, we get a bit of a short, quick time sense of satisfaction and being able to, you know, mete out that justice. The problem with this, of course, is that we really do miss what the actual root causes of these events are. So I'm going to tell you a story from a completely different industry, just to kind of take a break from everything we've been talking about today, because often when we can, you know, get above the trees, right, we see the forest again, and we don't get lost in all of the minutia and the ones and zeros of cybersecurity and healthcare, and we kind of remember what some of the major principles are behind this. So let's start here. So back in 1983, there was an airline flight, Air Canada 143, which is a passenger flight traveling between Montreal and Edmonton. It's about a 2,000-mile journey. It was a beautiful sunny day. It was a perfect day for flying, in fact. And it was a 767, which at the time was a brand new aircraft. In fact, this one had rolled off the assembly line at Boeing just about 3-4 months earlier. Now, something that never happens with the sort of the safety level that we have in aviation of today, or at least at the time, at an altitude of 41,000 feet, the plane ran out of fuel. Now, that's frankly unheard of, right? These aren't things that happen, but it did. Miraculously, the flight crew was able to glide this 140-ton aircraft to a safe landing at a former and now disused Air Force base in a place called Gimli, Manitoba. So about halfway between the distances, somewhere around Winnipeg, Manitoba, and they didn't quite make it that far. There were only minor injuries, and you can see from the photograph there's the emergency slides that deployed, and the only people that were injured were the ones that decided to go to the tail of the downward dog plane and decide to slide down. So we're talking sprained ankles, which when you consider the peril that they were in, this is, you know, effectively a very, very happy ending. Now, because the unusual incident that's occurred, it was given the nickname the Gimli glider, and of course we know the press and the media always like to come up with these sorts of alliterisms and so on. And the other piece of this is really important, is that several attempts by other crews who were given the same circumstances programmed into a simulator resulted in catastrophic crashes. This was sort of a 1 in a billion type of event, and it was miraculous, as I said, that the crew was able to manage it so successfully. Now, for those who are eagle-eyed, you may find something that is quite anomalous to be seen in the middle of a runway. It is very apparent in this photograph, and I'll get back to that towards the end of the presentation. Now, of course, as I said, what they did was miraculous, but here, following the airline's investigation, Captain Pearson was demoted for 6 months, and his first officer was also suspended, along with 3 maintenance workers. Now, as I said, in these types of events, it's easy to blame a single actor, right? To say in a cybersecurity parlance that, you know, this was a nation state, or this was an advanced sophisticated cyber criminal, or it was an insider, or whatever it was. Because in doing this sort of allows us off the hook. When we find an antagonist, we don't have to think about all the other factors. We don't have to think about budgeting, resources, what our board decided to do, how we establish risk levels, and so on. And that, by extension, means we absolve ourselves of all this sort of responsibility around this event. So I'm going to dive into this one in a second and then flip it back to security. So let's look at what happened here. The first thing that I think is a critical message in this from Sidney Dekker, who is a well-known author and also a experienced and long-term aviation safety investigator, is that when we blame the people, we miss the chance to learn. And he goes farther by saying that human error is really rarely the cause, and it's more a symptom of underlying systemic problems. And I think that's critical, right? We have to look at all of the issues. Yes, a person made a mistake. They clicked on a link they shouldn't have. They were rushed in patient treatment, and maybe they didn't configure a system properly, right, when they started it. They share passwords. They do things like that we know are all in cybersecurity world no-nos. There's also a few other things that we bring in as humans, and these are biases. The first one is hindsight biases. the exaggerated ability to predict and prevent the disaster. Well, okay, I would have never let this mistake happen myself. And it's ironic that I see this quite often when I go through incident response simulations, how people jump to that conclusion, particularly the business people. They say, well, that's lunacy. Why would we have done this? But when you unfold it, you unpackage it, you see all the various issues and realize, you know what, we do this all the time. And in fact, often we are the culprit in making that decision. There's outcome bias. And of course, that's knowing the outcome tends us to lead ourselves to harsh judgment. Why wouldn't someone have updated that Apache server? I want that intern fired, right? Because somehow with that hindsight, we now realize what the ramifications were for the organization, and knowing the magnitude of that, we want to mete out that justice. And the last piece, which is I think the easiest one to understand, is a time bias, which is our tendency to focus on the most recent factor. And the analogy I use here, of course, is things like football. Right. So, you know, we're down to 3 seconds on the clock and the kicker comes out to kick the field goal to win the game. And when they miss, we blame the kicker. And we don't think about the other 59 minutes and 57 seconds of that match to think about all the passes that weren't made, the calls that were that should have been made instead of the ones that were, defensive plays that didn't work, etc. It's easy to lump all of the cause onto that one individual, the last person in the link in the chain. So if we look at what actually happened here, there are really 3 major factors, or you can cluster multiple factors into 3 major buckets. The first one is accountability, and we're all very familiar with this in a security kind of world and in a medical world, of course. Now in aviation, they have an agency, the FAA, who works in hand with the National Transport Safety Board, and they go in and they investigate these accidents and they determine what the root causes are. They make recommendations, the FAA federally mandates those. But there was another regulatory change at the heart of the story. And that was at the time, Canada, along with the aviation world, was switching from the imperial system of pounds and gallons to the metric system of kilograms and liters. And that's what contributed to this. So there were human miscalculations here as the pilots and the ground crew tried to convert these not only metric systems but also measurements. So think about with fuel, we pull up to the gas station and we pump gallons of gasoline into our cars. But if we all remember our high school science, liquid, of course, changes its volume depending on the temperature. So what we measure sitting on the ground in an airport will not be what we see in the tanks when we get to 40,000 feet and it's significantly colder. So they have to not only convert liters, but they have to go to a mass measurement. And that's where they confuse things. And anyone who's interested, I can actually show you the table of how this worked. But they put in about half the fuel that was necessary. So it's no shocker, about halfway through the journey, plane ran out of fuel. There was also a mechanical failure. So everybody get your outcome and your hindsight biases out here. The gas gauge on the aircraft wasn't working. Now, when you pay hundreds of millions of dollars for airplanes, they don't call them gas gauges or fuel gauges. They call them fuel quantity information systems, because that, you know, just allows you to put a 6 or 7 figure price tag on these things. And it was inoperable. And in fact, this was a known issue with the Boeing aircraft at the time, but there was a simple workaround. There's more story here about too many chefs ruining the stew, and that's exactly what happened. The pilots were aware that this wasn't going to be working, but here's the other part of this. This aircraft was a brand new type of aircraft, which was one of its first fly-by-wire generation type of planes, which means that it's no longer analog and mechanical instruments telling us altitude and directions and so on, and wires and pulleys connecting the control systems or the control mechanisms in the aircraft to whatever the flight control surfaces are and the throttles, the engines, etc. So it had a flight computer that could make these calculations for them, that could say, okay, based on the load of the plane and our destination and where we are, how much fuel do I need? And the pilots weren't fools. They actually did the equivalent of what we would do to measure the oil in our car. They put a dipstick in the tank to measure how much fuel was there. Again, the calculations were wrong, so their validations were wrong. But there were other factors here. There were 2 pilots instead of 3. So planes up till then and generations before this had 3. They had a flight engineer whose, guess what his primary job was? To check the amount of fuel that was being loaded on the plane. And there was obsolete governance here. There was no real checks and balances that said, well, now that that flight engineer is gone, who's actually responsible and accountable for making sure that the right quantity of fuel is loaded on the aircraft? And while these sound like sort of foreign issues, they're really not in cybersecurity terms, because we all deal with accountability, threats, and emerging technology. So if we look at it in our terms, sophisticated threats, I'm not going to dwell on these. We know about these. Yes, they're more advanced. Yes, they're more sophisticated, and we've seen a fair amount of them during COVID-19. But we also bring to the table our own sets of risks, right? Um, we are the ones who plan, who fund and deploy emerging technology. So things like cloud, right, is a primary example. HIoT connected medical devices, as we've been talking about all day. And of course, we had the perfect storm with COVID-19, where remote workers became also part of this distributed model. So Richard, in his opening, he talked about Skynet and Terminator. And to use another sort of science fiction analogy here, we think about virtual reality. Well, in our minds, this is something of Blade Runner sort of times. This is avatars and being able to visit alien worlds and use all five senses to experience that. But the reality is we do live in a virtual world. Except now what we're talking about is that triad of distributed workforces, cloud-based assets, and distributed workloads that we act upon them. And of course, is the accountability piece, right? And this is compliance and HIPAA and the alphabet soup of the various regulators that we have to deal with. But it's also our own initiatives. It's the contracts that we bring, the vendors that we validate. And we heard from some of the earlier speakers where they were talking about it. In fact, one said that, he spends most of his day on due diligence looking at vendors. And that's fairly common. So it's the obligations that we create and the safety nets, the assumptions that we create between us in this interconnected bidirectional web within our supply chain. And of course, as I said with COVID-19, and I'm not going to belabor this too much, we saw these attacks. We saw the clever guided attacks that use the confusion of COVID-19 to move around undetected within our environments, to take people who were already put in a pressure cooker, who were overstressed dealing with the medical issues around the pandemic. And now, of course, they used that to exploit them when it came to the cyber risks as well. And as I said, we had the move to remote workers. And interestingly, there's a model that's come out called the 5 levels of distributed workforces or distributed teams. And it looks at, one, the efficacy of these systems and the security of those systems, but also really how much of it is just trying to parallel. As in, we try to take the workplace that we had and replicate it in a distributed manner. So what did we do? Well, we all jumped on Zoom like we're on today. We use things like Slack so that we can do the virtual version of tapping a coworker on the shoulder to ask a quick question. But we don't really think about the fact that it's more than that, right? Why do we have to be tied to those old models? Why can't we, look at and investigate some of the advantages that we have working in a new paradigm? And of course is the accountability piece. And there's lots of information. If anybody would like a copy of this afterwards, I can certainly send you various insurance reports that have come out. But we've seen things like an over 200% increase since January of 2020 for the number of claims that have made under various cyber insurance policies. Ransom payments, as an example for ransomware, have also increased by 130%. Right. So the reality is, while the risks have gone up, while the emerging technology and our forced change through quarantine and the exploitation of these vulnerabilities by the sort of the criminal elements and nation states and so on, while that increases and that waterline goes up, the reality is we're still accountable. And we still have to determine how it is that we safely protect our operations, our employees, our medical workers, and of course, most importantly, our patients. Now, in the midst of all this, I think it's very easy for us to actually think that this is new, right? We talk about, for example, with a pandemic, this is a once in a lifetime. The last time we saw this was back in 1917, 1918 with the Spanish flu. But the reality is we see similar things, but we've seen them before. We're going to see them again. So yes, this pandemic may be a once every 100 years, once in a lifetime type of event, but some of the lessons and some of the forcing factors we have seen. So this is a picture from Lower Manhattan in one of the subway stations. And this is after the flooding that resulted from Hurricane Sandy back in 2012. Well, the same thing happened. One, we saw a massive increase in the number of attacks that occurred. In fact, I wouldn't say massive, it was about a 30% increase, but relatively speaking, it was nearly a doubling over the volume of traffic that had dropped. So we saw the same thing, like let's take, the criminals taking advantage of the chaos and the confusion around that event. But more importantly, it changed the way we looked at things like business continuity and disaster recovery. back then, think of New York. This was a decade after September 11th, right? And 9/11. So business continuity was predicated around the notion that the risks we had were having all of our eggs in that one basket, that we needed to move them out of those main buildings. And what did they do? They moved a lot of their backups across the Hudson River into New Jersey, which of course at the time made sense. Now, upon reflection, when a hurricane struck, because hurricanes don't follow state lines and they can cross a body of water, even one as big as the Hudson River, they realized that wasn't good enough, geographically speaking, and that they needed to be more dispersed. So the same things are going to happen. The same bars are going to raise and be changed when it comes to looking at the way we work, the way that we take those three factors, the threats, the emerging technology, and our accountability to manage those risks. The same thing is going to happen after the coronavirus. And in fact, we've already heard this today. How many times have we heard the expression, the new normal? And that's absolutely right. There will be a new normal across all sorts of different industries. So it's not just healthcare that we're talking about. The same thing will happen in technology and legal and finance and manufacturing, et cetera. In fact, I'm already watching it happen. And we'll have to see over the next couple of years how that plays out. And certainly I think the insurance industry and the courtrooms, unfortunately, to some degree, are going to establish where that new line in the sand really is. And that's a major theme that I've been pushing at the boardroom level. And in fact, Christopher Friends, I think, talked about this earlier in his Zero Trust talk, where he said one of the best tools is the incident response simulations, because it brings both business and the technical practitioners together. And they're right. I think we have to change the mindset. Thomas August just said it, right? He talked about being a good business partner. Cybersecurity is not an IT problem to solve. And it demands a cultural change within our organizations, where we now see cybersecurity not as the ones and zeros, but as business risk. And that means we change the vocabulary we use. We need that Rosetta Stone that translates ones and zeros into the dollar signs of risk. It also means we have to step back, right? It's no longer about finding that antagonist. It's more about understanding root cause. So ask what is responsible, not who. Understand why they made the decisions. In fact, I heard another talk on this issue, which I found really interesting, because they were talking about the meltdown at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania decades ago. And interestingly, at the time, one of the critical errors that was made was because of the biases that the experts who ran that nuclear reactor brought from their experience in the US Navy. Right? They were the most prestigious people when it came to understanding nuclear power. Unfortunately, there were paradigm shifts when it came to running a submarine or an aircraft carrier and running a terrestrial power plant. And that partially led to that meltdown. It's not because they were bad people. It's not because they were malicious. It's not because they were ignorant or they intentionally did this. It's because they looked at the world through their filters. So you want to understand why smart people make the decisions they make. And certainly it's very easy to say, well, I told you not to click on that. We've gone through awareness training. You should have known better. But when you put it in the context of what's actually happening in their day-to-day lives, it's a lot harder to do that. And sometimes people do make mistakes. And you want to seek forward accountability. So I've seen this in the various stories. In fact, in my book, I dive into some of this, where I talk about Desjardins, an insurance company, and Capital One, where they blame one an outside actor and another an inside actor. And it's very much a sort of a case closed. Well, we found the perpetrator. It's done, right? We can dust off our hands. And it isn't case closed. In fact, it's barely cased open, right? It's very much, as I say, it's sort of a ready, fire, aim kind of approach, which is to say, if we discover, say, with a partner, for example, that there's been an issue in a supplier, you can fire them, except as soon as you do that, they're going to guns with their legal defense. They're no longer working for you. You have broken the contract, and now you're adversaries. So you really do actually want to step back and say, okay, before we do this, let's understand the accountability. Let's understand what's happening, and let's make sure that we own our piece of it and that we make sure it doesn't happen again. So when it comes to this and finding factors, not fault, and I think in our leadership, particularly as a couple of our speakers have talked about in the panelists, on some of these panels, there's 3 documents that I would refer you to. The first is the Cyber Risk Oversight Guidelines from the National Association of Corporate Directors. It's a good brief document that explains to C-levels and board officers what their obligations in a cyber world mean. right? So how does that extend beyond things like other traditional fiscal or fiduciary responsibilities they would have? From the UK, the National Cybersecurity Center, which is the sort of the public arm of the GCHQ, they have their cybersecurity toolkit and board guidelines, and it also does an excellent job. And then there's a third book, which is Navigating the Digital Age, and that's certainly a longer reading investment when it comes to it. But regardless of which document you look at, it really can be dissected down into 5 key elements. The first one is awareness. So understanding the impact of the cyber risks, understanding as you adopt emerging technology like AI, like medical IoT, et cetera, what does that mean and what would the business impact of a breach likely be? Identifying those risks, right? Again, it's about your obligations. And you know, in healthcare, I don't have to preach this. You truly do understand this. You know what are non-public assets. You know what are protected assets, and what your obligations and responsibilities are around those. So those are, at least in this industry, a lot easier, I think, to define. Building that program, establishing budget, staffing, et cetera. And there's a couple of interesting things that have happened recently when it comes to this. So one, after the Capital One breaches, we saw it came out that, of course, that there were massive cuts to the cybersecurity funding and the programs that they were running, and some of those actually led to what occurred with their cloud-based storage of credit card information. Right. The second piece of this is that in some cases we really have to think about what the liabilities are when it comes to these programs. Along with those earlier events that occurred with the Capital One breach, just in the last 2 months, there's of course a resulting class action suit that's occurred because of this. And a very interesting decision was made by the judge. The plaintiffs in this case wanted to have disclosed the Mandiant incident response report that came out, which of course Mandiant was brought in after the fact to determine what had happened, to make sure that they were no longer being victimized, that things were back in control, et cetera. In most cases, many companies actually use client attorney privilege to protect that. So they have their legal representative bring in the incident response firm, and by doing so, it becomes what's called a work product, and it's a protected asset that cannot be discovered in court. Unfortunately, due to some of the way that the accounting procedures were made, the fact that it was tied into a larger budget, that it was tied into a larger ongoing contract with the vendors, it was no longer under that privilege, which means it will be exposed. And as you can imagine, that is very much like an OCR document where they've come in and they've done a corrective action plan. So the same things will now be exposed in a public format of that courtroom. So you really do have to think about the changing accountability legal landscape and what that means for you. There's the reporting piece, which we won't get into in great detail here, but really this is about how does the board and the executive talk, right? How, as Tom August said, how do you come together, right, and be those business partners? And this really does become your Rosetta Stone that does that. And the last piece, as I've already said, is the incidences, and of course is the real world ones. But more importantly, if we step back and more realistically, it's going through those simulations. It's helping organizations, and particularly non-technical practitioners, understand those risks, understand the type of non-IT decisions that may have to be made. Do we shut down a medical imaging suite? Do we have to put a whiteboard in our lobby that says do not connect? As an example, we know what the business and the health impact of that may be when it comes to treating patients. So we really do have to understand that it is a full team responsibility here that goes right from the bottom of the organization right to the very top. So if I go back to our story for a minute, I didn't really describe exactly how this all happened, and we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm just sort of gonna indulge me here for a bit while I talk about this. So at 40,000 feet, the first engine flamed out. At that point, the pilots declared an emergency, and they started looking for an alternative landing site in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which I said was about halfway to their intended destination. Well, a few minutes later, as the pilots just assumed, because this was new technology, that it was probably a computer glitch, the second engine flamed out, which means it was starved of fuel and also stalled. So they were now powerless. Of course, because they declared an emergency, they had already started descending. They had actually given away about 13,000 feet, which in anyone who understands powerless flight or gliding, altitude and speed are your friends, and lack of those are your enemy. So they had already bled off too much altitude, which means they weren't going to make Winnipeg. Now, here is where we start to blame the humans, but really let's turn around and realize that they are actually the protagonists of the story, not the antagonist. As it turned out, Captain Pearson was actually a very experienced glider pilot. So he was comfortable dealing with powerless flight. It also turned out that the first officer, Quintel, had served in the Air Force, and he knew about 10 nautical miles north of their present location was a disused Air Force base. It was no longer on standard FAA maps, aeronautical maps, but he knew it was there. The pilot, trusting his co-pilot, bravely turned the plane north, and they went for that shorter destination. Now, the real trick in this, of course, is, as I said, they needed the altitude and the speed. So the pilot kept them too high and too fast for the entire time, because the slower the plane gets, the less air flows over the wings, means the less the control surfaces also work. Also, without lack of power, because they had no engines, they only had minimal systems. So they had some mechanical dials and instruments, things like altitude and bearings from a compass and radio, but that was sort of it. That's all they had. And when they dropped the landing gear upon approach, it had to use what they call a gravity drop, which means it's not pumped down by hydraulics. You just have to trust that the weight of the actual equipment locks it into place. And it didn't, of course. So with about several thousand feet to go, the captain put the plane into what's called a forward slip, which would probably be incredibly terrifying for anyone on board. That is literally, you turn the plane one way and you bank it the opposite. So you snowplow through the air, and it's a rapid way of losing airspeed and, of course, losing altitude and dropping. In fact, one passenger on board the plane said he could actually see the golf course they were flying over, and he could see which club the golfer was using at that point. And the people on the other side of the plane obviously just saw skies. I'm sure they were terrified. And at the last minute, he was able to level the plane out and land. Now, of course, they came in, as I said, too fast. Also, the aircraft, the nose gear hadn't locked in place. And as you saw from that previous picture, the nose dropped. Now, I mentioned earlier that there was something anomalous in that one photograph. And that was unbeknownst to the pilots and also the air traffic controllers in Winnipeg that were trying to help them. It turned out that the runway had been converted into a racetrack and a drag strip by a local racing club. And in fact, the day of that event, the race club was hosting a huge friends and family event. So there were thousands of people at this track watching the various events go on. There was kids racing go-karts and riding bicycles up and down the runway. But the one thing that saved them all that day was the fact that there was a guardrail had been placed down the 6,800-foot runway. And the pilot was able to use it. So when the nose gear dropped, he kicked the rudder and used the brakes to hold the nose of the aircraft against the guardrail so that it slid straight down the middle of the runway and didn't tend to careen off to the side and barrel roll, which of course would have probably killed most of the passengers on board. Worse, it would have also slid through all of the campers and the family members and children that happened to be playing at the side of this event. So the reality is in this, and this is what I really want you to take away, is that it's important to look at all of the factors and not just to consider the human elements, but to consider all of the other ones, the systemic issues that went around this, right? The fact that they had regulatory changes to the measurement systems that they were using, metric instead of imperial. There was a new type of aircraft, and we see this time and time again. In fact, working in cloud security, one of the biggest issues I see is misconfigurations in cloud security settings, right? People just don't fully understand them, or they're translating a knowledge from a different paradigm of on-premises to cloud, and they think that's going to work, and it doesn't always. So in my book, I describe this in far greater detail. In fact, I go into the story, and I certainly delve through similar stories to this to also talk about other aspects of cybersecurity. But there's 4 things I want you to take away here. One is that expertise beats headcount, and that your skills always must change and adapt. They have to match your expanding and evolving ecosystem. Remember also that those gaps exist at all levels of the business. So often we think security expertise gaps exist in our teams. So we say, well, I need someone who knows cloud or needs IoT. But we don't think about the board that also doesn't understand what the implications of those changes are. You need to evaluate the systems, and I've talked about that today. Look at all of the root causes. Don't just say, well, a server wasn't updated, and that's because an intern made a mistake. Maybe that intern wasn't trained, or they were overworked, understaffed. Why didn't we budget the resources to do that through automation tools, et cetera? We really have to think about all of those issues. And ultimately, remember that security equals business risk. It's not a simple IT problem to solve. We no longer live in that world. When you talk about the top of the pyramid, it's the accountability piece. That's what ends up being in the headlines. That's what happens in a courtroom, unfortunately, if we ever get there. But more often than not, that's what becomes the most important piece when we consider insurance and claims and whether or not they are actually paid out or whether they are denied. So with that, I thank you very much for your time and attention today. It's been a really, really interesting conference for me personally. I hope that my talk was interesting for you, and I'll pass this back to Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you very much for presenting your stories and anecdotes there. It's always wonderful to hear your stories and to relate those back to business, which at the end of the day is really what security is all about, supporting the business. And just a little quick note about your book, Mark. When is it available? When's it available in stores?
Yeah, thanks very much, Richard. It comes out end of October. You can pre-order now.
Yep. And I was fortunate enough to get a pre-read of most of it, so I can attest that it's well worth a read and none too heavy as well. So thank you very much, Mark, for sharing everything here today, and also to our other attendees.